You. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, I'm in the middle of talking to an old friend, and we said, "Oh, okay, why don't I record this and make it into a show?" And he said, "Well, I don't have an hour." And I said, "Okay, I'll take what I can get." His name is Seth Klein, and boy, he's really an old friend. I've known him since he was not a toddler, but a very young man, and and he just looks the same as ever. So it's great.
A little more gray in the beard now, Meta.
Yeah, well, I've got a few gray hair in my head. Anyway, it's wonderful to see you again, Seth, and we're really just getting caught up. But I want to ask him about his work and about his project because he wrote a book. What was the title again?
A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency.
Right, thank you.
Came out in 2020.
2020, about a really interesting idea. You know, the point was that World War II, people got able to transfer from peace production to war production in just almost overnight, and it was so efficient.
And then back again. Let's not forget the other direction. I mean, part of what's interesting about the World War II story is that we retooled the economy twice. Mm-hmm. Once to ramp up military production, and again to reconvert back to a peacetime economy in the space of 6 years. So when I was running to write a book about climate and this disconnect between what the scientists say we urgently have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain, I thought, I'm going to dig into the World War II story because so many of us have this question, like, can we actually retool the economy quickly in the way that we need to? And I thought I'd dig into that previous time, and the more I dug in, the more parallels I started to see, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around those World War II lessons.
Well, there's actually a new book called Abundance, which I think is probably not unrelated to the argument. You put together quite a different argument, but this guy,
I haven't
Klein,
Ezra Klein,
and
no
Darren
relation,
Thompson, right?
no relation,
but two smart people.
So I haven't read Abundance. I've read some excerpts and followed the discussion about it. You're right that there's certain parallels. You're not the first person to talk to me, to flag for me that there's certain parallels, because they're both wrestling with the question, how do we return to a public sector that can move quickly and that can build quickly? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I agree with all of Ezra's explanations for what's making everything take too long. And I imagine there's differences between Canada, where I am, and the US, where he is, in terms of what's slowing things down. Interestingly, even in World War II, the minister who oversaw this incredible ramp up in military production was this guy, C.D. Howe. Mm-hmm. He was frustrated too. It's not like this is new, but he was frustrated by the slow pace of government. And ended up kind of creating a whole parallel public service. He created 28 Crown enterprises during the war. He recruited these, his buddies from the private sector to head it up. He even created, if you've ever worked in government, you know that government lawyers tend to tell you what you're not allowed to do. Mm-hmm. He had no patience for it. So he created his own legal department in the Department of Munitions and Supply, with 3 shifts of lawyers, including a night shift, so that they could quickly expedite things and approve projects. So in some ways, it's an age-old question: how do we pivot in an emergency to actually hit speed and scale?
Well, I love his book, and I think he's absolutely right. But he talks of it as a governmental issue only. And I see the same problems as personal frustration that individuals have, which I think, well, let me back up a little. A friend of mine was Paul Werbos, who's kind of the father of the new AI. He wrote a dissertation 50 some years ago about something called back propagation. and it was the basis for the new AI. And so he's been running into people who complain constantly. For example, on a ship that went on a cruise, he said every meal it was a different group of people, and they were all talking about nothing except their frustration and annoyance with being unable to get any work done because of computer problems that just slow them down, and they keep changing the system and they drive you crazy, and people can't do it. And I'm a happy person. I never cry. I never get angry, except once a month or so, or even more often, when I have something that drives me bananas on the computer and I scream, I cry, I pound on the table, I I go berserk. And Paul was actually running the polling station in Washington. And he said that the people came through and that's all they were talking about, as they can't do their computer stuff. And if you look at the figures show that we waste an average an hour a day. A normal person wastes an hour a day trying to do things like find people's email addresses or find their way through an e-banking form that they can't figure out what to click on and so on. It's an hour a day that we lose, and we try, So this woman who came through, she said, "I'm on the Democratic Steering Committee," because he's in Virginia, and she's on the U.S. Democratic Steering Committee. She said, "We should have told Kamala that she should promise in her platform to make it easier to use the computer." And it's not just the computer itself, but it's other things like appealing to get your money refunded if you have a problem with Amazon or something.
Or the right to repair.
Yeah,
The right to
everything is
repair without having
frustration.
to
Our
contend with all these
lives are
people.
screwed up more by technology, which I love. I'm completely a pro tech person, but our lives are absolutely messed up more by that than any other problem. I have no other problems in life but that one, and that's a biggie.
Well, I think there's lots of reasons why things take too long, and that's probably one of them. I think there are others, including ones that Ezra doesn't talk about, like the fact that we do so much publicly as public-private partnerships instead of just doing it publicly. We have this built-in requirement to do it as a partnership with the private sector, which makes everything infinitely more complicated. More lawyers are involved and complicated contracts, and everything just ends up taking longer and in fact costing more. What I encounter talking to elected leaders, though, federally and provincially in my work, is very often just a failure of imagination. Part of what I was trying to do with telling this 80-year-old World War II story was just excavate that reminder of how quickly we can get things done. I don't know that it's ultimately about technology, though. Like in the climate work that I do,
he says it's about regulations, and he says that these are all excellent regulations for good reason. They're fine. They're meant to make everybody more accountable to the public, but they just slow us down too much.
But this is my point is that by doing it as a public-private partnership, you make the process of oversight and regulation inherently more complicated. The point I was going to make about technology and climate, though, is that in many respects, when we think about what we have to do to electrify our lives, wind turbines and heat pumps and things like that, these are not more complicated than warships and airplanes. So we ought to be able to do it at speed and scale again.
I mean, you say the guy had round-the-clock lawyers trying to find their way through this, and they could do it. But I mean, Ezra really doesn't give us an answer. And I don't think there is an answer, because we don't want to repeal all of these rules saying, yes, they have a rule about how many women you're going to hire. And if you hire women, do you have health care services for their children or child care services? And if you have child care services, are they serving these kids nutritious food? And who are they hiring to be the child care people? And how much concrete are you going to use? And what quality of the concrete are you using? And blah, 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 blah.
I
And
don't know that that's what necessarily slows everything down. I mean, look, for example, here in British Columbia, where I live, in the 90s, the government, the NDP government of the day, was building a highway on Vancouver Island. And they had certain equity goals they wanted to accomplish. They wanted, typically construction, very male oriented. They wanted to make sure that a sufficient number of women and Indigenous people got trained up on how to do that work because it's well-paid work. And typically, highways are constructed by the private sector. The government doesn't have like a department of a bunch of construction workers that build highways. They contract with the building with different construction companies. So what did they do? They did something really clever. They created a crown enterprise, a temporary crown corporation that would do the actual hiring. So they let out contracts to these different private sector builders for certain sections of the highway. But they said, you have to hire your people through Highway Constructors Limited, their crown corporation. And by doing that, they were able to ensure that certain equity goals got met in the training and in the apprenticeships, and they got the job done. So this is part of what I argue in the book, is we actually need to go back to the creation of certain crown enterprises. You and I started to talk before we turned on the recording. One of our main campaigns is this campaign for a youth climate corps. This idea that we would have a new public program. Don't contract it out to the private sector. A new public program that would say to anyone under 35, if you want to spend 2 years enlisting in this battle of our lives, get trained up in emergency response in the face of fires or floods or heat domes, or building up community or ecological resilience in the face of these events, or most importantly, get trained up in building retrofits and renewable energy installation. We would have a place for you. No one would be turned away, because why would you in an emergency? But I'll tell you, and this is where I come back to this point about the failure of imagination and the reason I've been trying to excavate this old story. I remember having a conversation a year or so ago with a senior federal public servant who I won't name, but who liked the idea, could see its benefit, gets climate. And at a certain point in the conversation, he says, but it's unclear to me who we would send a check to. And I said, yeah, you don't get it. You have to lead. You create the program. You hire the young people. You deploy them to these projects. But it's like an imagination muscle that has become atrophied, where in government itself defaults to an assumption that somebody else has to actually build and lead and do it. And the best that government can do is cut a check. Even in the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, where we saw the government pivot with remarkable speed, I would say, in Canada, and created these, within a few weeks, the CERB, the income support program, the wage subsidy program. That was remarkable. But still, it was writing a check, getting a check out the door, not creating new institutions, which is what I think this moment actually calls for.
I'm thinking back to when I was a girl, and there were this was actually mostly against the Depression, but I think it probably ended when the war started, as a matter of fact, because I remember the beginning of the war. Of course, I'm 93. But we had these PWA or CCC, two different.
That's right. So you're American. You're American originally.
I am American.
Yeah.
And there were camps that young people would go to.
But that's what we're modeling this on. So in the New Deal and the Public Works Administration had the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And
Mhm.
so in the States, the Sunrise Movement, the youth movement, climate movement, has called for a similar thing called the Youth Climate Corps, and we've borrowed that idea for our campaign in Canada. It's a similar idea. Um, Although, the original 1930s CCC was both amazing. I mean, the whole legacy of national parks in the United States and the trails and a lot of that is the historic legacy of what that program built.
I didn't know it was a connection. That's
Oh
interesting.
yes, yes, yes. But it was mostly for men and very gendered and very racist and it paid crap. So we're trying to imagine a YCC that is much more inclusive and partnered with indigenous communities and pays the living wage. Um,
Mhm.
and the polling we've done is that people will find the idea extremely attractive, and that people under 35 would be extremely keen to do it to sign up.
I don't know. Compare that to the Peace Corps, or I've forgotten what Canada has or had something equivalent, but I don't even remember the Canadian title
I
for
mean,
it.
there's different, there was Canada World Youth and Katimavik and these kinds of programs. The difference is those other programs tend to be small. They tend to be off contracted out to a private sector, a nonprofit to operate. But you have to apply. Like they have a very finite number of spots. So in some ways, and I think you, given your history and work, will appreciate this. When we think about, again, there's lots of models out there. But if we think, what is the one program that is a genuinely national program that is particularly barrier free, especially for young people from a disadvantaged background, um, and that really tries to operate on that idea of taking anyone who wants in. It's the military, um, and training people up and that kind of thing, helping to pay for their post-secondary studies after. It's the military. And what we're saying with the YCC is let's make a different offer.
I'm all for it. Now, does that mean that I agree with you that all you need to do is give people more imagination? No, I don't. I think we've got structural um, built-in rule books that whether you're talking about corporations, I just had somebody delivered paint and spilled it all over the thing, and it was Amazon's fault. It was their paint, and I can't tell you what I went through to just get my money back, much less. I mean, there's certainly no such thing as apology for the fact that, probably hundreds of dollars, and all my neighbors were busy trying to clean up the spill and everything. I mean, it's just outrageous. You cannot deal with a corporation and with any efficiency. So I think that we've just set things up to be difficult
Publicly.
on purpose. And why, I don't know, but at any rate, the only solution I know, because really Ezra Klein, although he complains and he makes his point, and I think I'd like to know, for example, more about what in the hell went wrong in California that they couldn't get eminent domain and build that railroad. They couldn't do it and they gave up.
Hmm.
What went wrong? It wasn't a failure of imagination; it was something else, and they gave up. But at any rate, I think he gives an example of people who are just, they have, I use a crude word. I won't use a crude word, but they have the guts um, to say, I'm just going to override
I'm
the
just going to make
rule
it
book.
happen. Well,
Yeah.
look, I
Well,
do. I'm just
there's some, when that ship ran into a bridge and just, ruined everybody's life.
yeah.
The mayor or I guess the governor or something just said, I'm not going to pay attention to the rules. I'm going to cut right through this and we're going to get these things done. And he
Well,
did.
we need more people like that. We do need more people. And this, again, this was part of my what drew me into the World War II story. Is I think we were well served by people who not only had imagination, but that kind of just get it done attitude.
Mhm.
Um, and we do need that. You need people like that in an emergency. And the climate is an emergency. I think Canada is facing different emergencies. I think the housing crisis is an emergency. We need people who bring that spirit to it. And yet, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater either. Like
Exactly. Mhm.
there is, I do write in my book about there are times when the government goes in with a just get it done attitude, with a heavy hand, and they do a lot of damage. And they can
And
and they can
the other
right
side of it is then you have a really authoritarian government.
right
And I think my feeling is that there are reasons why the MAGA people support Trump is they find this planet too hard to live on
yeah,
nowadays.
and they're
And if we
looking for a
just go
strong
back to
guy.
the simpler life, everything would be easier. And I tend to agree with them sometimes. But what we need is more democracy, but of a kind that gives some counterweight to bureaucratization. I mean,
Yeah,
look, I'm a sociologist and I refer to Max Weber all the time. And Max Weber, had this image of modern society as an iron cage, and everybody is locked up in these rules and until we can't breathe or move or anything. And I
mm,
think that's sort of what we have. But what are we going to do? He couldn't figure out a way to have democracy because we need these rules and we need rational legal authority, not charismatic authority or traditional authority. We need rules. So what do? Well, you set up, I think, citizens assemblies,
hmm
and you have a I would love it if trying to get justice for this spilled white paint all over the condo building, not my apartment out there. I called Amazon and went through all this rigmarole. If we had something like a panel of 7 citizens that would be selected like a jury by sortition from the community, and each of them would agree to serve a few hours for 6 months. And there'd be a panel of people, and I would send in my complaint to them, and they would look it over. It would take them 5 minutes to say, Amazon, you ought to make this right. Why
right.
don't you send a check for $100 to this condo and apologize
Well, look,
and
Meta,
send a
I'm
potted plant or a box of chocolate to all of the neighbors who got paint on their clothes by cleaning up this mess? Do that. It'll take them 5 minutes to make this recommendation to Amazon. Amazon would do it, and it would save me all of this hassle. They don't
well,
need
I
to
doubt it would be
repeal
five
any
minutes.
rules.
I'm all for the increased use of citizen assemblies. I'm not sure that using it for spilled paint might be overkill, Meta.
Well, what would you do? How are you going to fix it? Because if people are voting for Trump because they can't stand living in a world where they get the runaround and the
Yeah,
etc., which I
yeah,
felt some people are, then what's the alternative?
yeah. These might be separate problems, but there's a problem that you're describing with your example that feels more like a accountability problem. And it's a private sector problem. It's not a public sector problem. Um,
There's no difference. You get the same thing if you try to call Social Security.
yeah, yeah. I mean, in the public system, we generally have like ombuds people for some of these things that would function similarly to your panel.
Really? All right, let's play with that. How are we going to expand that so that I would know I would be able to actually use it?
Yeah, well, and this is where I'm saying, like, if you're in the public system and you have a complaint about healthcare or social services, in most places we have ombuds people that you go to. But I don't know that does Amazon? I don't know. I mean, partly I think what we're wrestling with is we're living in a world in which large chunks of our lives are the domain of these mega corporations, um, with outsized influence and power in our lives, and not nearly the kind of accountability that they should have. And I think that in the public square, in that in the imagination of the MAGA people you're describing, it all gets conflated. The anger and frustration with a public thing here or a private thing here. They just want a strong man to put an end to all of it.
So how do you do it without a strong man? You need something like panels of, citizens assemblies of.
Like I say, I like the idea for the public sector to make more use of citizen assemblies, but I think they are, in fact, we had one here on electoral reform
Mhm.
about 20 years ago in British Columbia, which was excellent, did excellent work. But it's a big job, effectively setting up and running a citizen assembly. And it strikes me that they should be employed for those particularly thorny and challenging conundrums, um, where where I see citizen assemblies being particularly helpful is when, in some ways, elected leaders need the cover of a citizen assembly to green light uh, controversial things, where they're afraid to do it on their own. But very often, I think when the public sees a citizen assembly deliberating, in the same way that that we tend to kind of give some honor and respect to juries in our legal system, we see our fellow citizens spending time wrestling with tough things. And then even if we don't necessarily agree with the outcome, we're still prepared to say, you guys did a good job. You worked hard, and I'll honor your recommendation.
Look, I will take whatever you can give me. If you're
Okay.
willing to promote this for the public sector, and that's probably the right place
I
to
don't have
start.
private sector solutions for you, but it strikes me
I
to
don't
be,
know why they're separate. I mean, I think corporations should have some kind of accountability.
yeah.
And
But again, if you're going to have it, it's not by having less regulation, like as Klein is talking about. It's going to be by having more.
no, you can keep your regulations. The regulations are reasonable, but sometimes you just need to
Well, you need a
relax them a little
mechanism to
bit.
enforce
Just
them.
give people a little wiggle room and say, well, normally this is a good answer, but in fact, in this case, white paint all over the mailroom. Well, you need
Anyway,
something extra.
man, this is not my expertise.
Okay,
So, so let's talk about what you want to talk about, that I have something to offer beyond what
sure.
any
You can
kind of
tell me
low.
about your project. I didn't know you were part of David Suzuki's empire.
Oh, I wouldn't call it an empire. And I'm not, I don't live in the David Suzuki Foundation, which is the larger organization that he started way back in the day, but in something called the David Suzuki Institute, which actually which is not the farthest thing from an empire. It's super small. It just has a volunteer board, and we're the largest thing it does. So it's a nonprofit, but not a charity, which has allowed us to be a bit more political than some charities. So that's where my team and I reside.
Is this youth core thing your only or main?
It's not the only. So partly what we do in the Climate Emergency Unit is organize coalitions and joint campaigns around what I would call genuine climate emergency ideas that kind of derive from my book. Um, and we employ a framework that I call the 6 markers of emergency. How do you know when a government, or really the leadership of any large institution, is genuinely in emergency mode? And the 6 markers are: it spends what it takes to win, creates new economic institutions to get the job done, moves from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. Number 4, it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis. Number 5, it commits to leave no one behind, understanding that mobilizations require social solidarity and inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And number 6, it centers Indigenous leadership rights and title. So we've initiated a number of campaigns, but they all kind of come under that framework. The Youth Climate Corps campaign is one of our flagship campaigns, and it's because it actually ticks every one of those 6 marker boxes except mandatory. It doesn't tick number 3, but it's an example of how you would spend what it takes to win. It is a new economic institution. It is part of telling the truth, because a program at scale like this would communicate to the public and to young people, we get the emergency and we're inviting you to meet this moment with us. It's part of leaving no one behind, because it's a way of training up a whole generation of young people in the jobs of the future. And if done and governed right, it would center Indigenous rights and title and in its governance. So that's why that's one of our key campaigns.
Elaborate your thing about the Indigenous. This is going to be particularly inviting Indigenous participation, or what?
Well, the idea with the Corps is that it would have jobs in one of 3 buckets. So bucket 1 is emergency response in the face of fires and floods, etc. Number 2 is building community and ecological resilience, and bucket 3 is renewable energy and building retrofits and so on. In our imagination, the young people would be deployed on projects in one of these 3 areas that align with local climate action plans. So, many Indigenous communities have their own climate action plans. They have about 20% of the renewable energy projects in the country are happening under Indigenous leadership. It's very often Indigenous communities that are on the front lines of those extreme weather events like forest fires and floods.
I know that. Okay.
I think, I'm not saying the whole project would be under Indigenous leadership, but I think you would want the young people deployed at projects at the local level, and a bunch of those would be with Indigenous communities.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, okay. So how do you get from here to there? I certainly, I think it's a great idea.
We've been campaigning on it, and with some success. We have Youth Climate Corps activist campaign chapters in about 10 cities across the country. They've been working hard. They have succeeded in the last federal election. The Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens all had it in their platforms that they would institute it. And now we have a new government where we have to make them do it.
Well, would they also go abroad?
That wasn't part of the model. I mean, it wasn't intended as a Peace Corps, but interestingly, you asked about other campaigns. One of our other campaigns that we call the Fair Shares Project is around, Canada's been talking a lot about its own climate plans, but of course, this is a global effort, and we're not going to win this thing alone, and so the Fair Shares Project is specifically around what is the particular responsibility of a wealthy country like Canada that has disproportionately contributed to the problem in terms of climate finance and technology transfer to help not only lower emissions in our own country, but around the world.
Go on. I mean, I'm not sure what that would amount to.
Well, I mean, it's just about broadening the conversation and saying to the federal government, yeah, you have a climate plan for Canada. It's not good enough. It needs to be stronger, but also this has to figure into, our international development plans, and we're going to have to, again, I keep pulling from this World War II story,
Mm.
because the time at which Canadian aid was at its highest was after the war. At the very time, even though we had a record level of debt to GDP ourselves, that was when we maximized our support internationally, because that's what being an emergency mindset actually allows.
Okay. I have a whole different line of conversation, but I don't want to start it because I know you're going to leave.
Yeah, I got to go in a couple of minutes.
I'll tell you what I would talk about if I wanted to pick a fight with you. Because I watched a conversation between David Suzuki and David Keith. And I'm on David Keith's side, although not really completely. David Keith, I'm really convinced that as of now, there is no way to save us from an absolute catastrophe, short of doing some kind of global intervention in climate repair. And I have hosted probably hundreds, not probably, but for sure, hundreds of conversations about that, about some version of climate repair. And my least favorite would be the kind that David Keith is promoting, which is mainly spraying sulfur up there
Yeah.
high and blotting out the sun, which I scared a little bit about because it's going to
There's
stay
all
up
kinds
there.
of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I'm not expert in these geoengineering questions. They do make me very nervous and uncomfortable, in part because, I feel like on the technology side, so often everyone's looking for a get out of jail free card. What's the technology thing that will prevent us from having to change our lives? And I think we actually have to change our lives. I think
Sure.
that we probably will still need some other way, as you're suggesting, of drawing down carbon and bringing us to a safe level, and it may well be too late. But I worry that people lock onto these solutions as a way of not actually figuring out how to urgently lower our emissions. Um, yeah.
Well, I agree with you, but I don't because I don't see why you have to say, well, first we should change our lifestyle. And then if that doesn't work, and in fact, we know damn well it absolutely would not.
I'm not saying it's either or. I'm not saying it's either or.
Well,
I'm
but
saying,
people are treating it as either or.
well,
They treat
because
not
of,
either or, but first this and then maybe that if we have to. But we
but
have
I'm,
to go
but I'm,
down.
all I'm saying is I'm wary that those techno solutions are grasped onto as a way of avoiding the other stuff that we need to do, and I'm wanting to avoid that. And to your larger point about things being too late, I mean, look, and maybe we should end with this thought,
Mhm.
that when you and I met in the 80s, when where that time when I cut my teeth politically in the peace and disarmament movement pre the end of the Cold War, and that was also, of course, an existential threat. And there were young people then worried like they are today. But the issue functioned differently, right? It kind of, I mean, there were accidents and things like that. But generally speaking, the fear of like global nuclear war was that it either would happen or it wouldn't happen. And climate doesn't work that way. Climate is already happening.
Mhm.
And we talk about it being a matter of degrees because we live in this awkward moment where even if we were to do everything perfect starting tomorrow, things will still get worse before they get
Yeah.
better. And any way you cut it, we are in for some painful losses and tragedies. And yet it's also true that each incremental degree increase we can avoid saves that many more people and places that we love. Um, and that's why we say it's a matter of degrees. But that doesn't mean we don't have to do everything that we.
I don't know anybody who doesn't agree that we have to do everything. Certainly, cutting emissions is absolutely fundamental, no doubt about it. But even if we cut all the emissions starting maybe 40 years ago, it would be enough. But it's been
Yeah. Oh,
way past
we've
being
waited too
possible.
long. We ragged the puck, as we say in Canada. Um, uh, but mostly, and this is the point of the work I do now, we need to get back to an emergency mindset.
Mhm.
Uh, because whether, like in the war, like in the first year of the pandemic, the point is when we can talk about whether one approach is better than another approach, but that's sort of missing the point. The main point is there's nothing about the current government approach that looks and sounds and feels like an actual emergency response.
You're right. And I think emergency response really means it's like if the bathtub is about to overflow, you can either pull out the plug or you can turn off the faucet, and it really doesn't matter which you
Doesn't matter, just do one of them and
do.
quick.
Do it both right away. And I'm in favor of a little bit of dripping your toe in the water to see what we can do by way of climate repair. And I think we should. It's such an emergency. We have to do that.
Mm.
So that's the conversation we would have another time. Anyway, I'll get to you about setting up another conversation about green energy or Green New Deals. Okay.
Sounds
Not
good.
energy, Green New Deals. Deal?
Nice to chat, Meta.
Wonderful. Love you. Okay. Bye.